So we are in Acts chapter 24 tonight, and before we keep on going into Acts chapter 24, does anybody have any questions on what we've been talking about? You know, what we've been talking about is Paul went to Jerusalem. He was minding his own business, not causing any trouble, but a riot started not because of what he was doing, but because of the hatred that people had about what he believed and what he and how he served God. If you remember that Roman commander broke things up and got a hold of Paul. By the way, anybody remember what that Roman commander's name was? Listus. We found out, last week when he wrote that letter to Felix. He said Listus. So, now we've got the commander's got a name. But you remember, he got Paul, he took him to Sanhedrin court the next day to try to figure out what in the world was going on, to which Paul, noticing that there was the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he said that he is a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee, and he was on trial for the hope of the resurrection, and that just simply threw everything in turmoil, because the Pharisees believed in the resurrection and the Sadducees did not. And so they started to turn on each other, and what they were really there to do to figure out what was going on with Paul was kind of lost in the shuffle. You remember that the reason why Paul got to Caesarea, and that's where we're at tonight, is because that plot was formed against his life. And so Listus sent him up to the Roman governor to get him out of Jerusalem. And so what we're looking at in chapter 24 is Paul and his really kind of a trial before Felix. It's not necessarily a trial, like what we would think of a trial. There really aren't any charges at this point against Paul, but there does need to be something that would get to the bottom of this. And meanwhile, until they get to the bottom of it, Paul is being held captive. Not captive like in a dungeon, a jail cell. He was in the palace there. But nonetheless, he really can't leave. He's just kind of confined there. And so starting out in the first couple of verses, what we see are the Jews kind of come down and start to make this accusation against Paul. Now, when you take a look at verse number 1, we see that it says, 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus. Now, 5 days, meaning that the first day, Paul would have went to Caesarea, okay? Second day, probably messengers from Caesarea would have gone down and told the Sanhedrin court what was going on. Third day is the Sanhedrin court started to figure out what in the world they were going to do about the situation. Fourth day, they probably travel back up there. And then fifth day, here they are having this trial, if you will. Okay. Now here you've got the high priest Ananias. You've got some other elders there, but you also got a lawyer whose name is Tertullus. What's interesting about this is Tertullus is a Roman name. And so, this man is a Jew. I mean, he's not a Gentile by any stretch of the imagination. He's a Jew. He's probably somebody who is on the Sanhedrin court. He's somebody, because he's a lawyer, he really is more like a very well-learned person about the Mosaic law. And so that's what lawyers were. They knew all the ins and outs and the details and everything like that. And so here's this man Tertullus. He's a Jew, but at the same time, since he's got this Roman name, you kind of have to wonder, is that the reason why they chose him to go and do the talking, do the orating? Because after all, he's standing in front of a Roman court, and so it kind of makes sense that you'd have somebody who at least maybe he grew up in Roman land, something like that, kind of like Paul, and so maybe he would have a little bit better understanding about how to present this case to this Roman governor. And so when they came and they brought their charges against Paul, what we see in verse number 2 is that he starts out by making this opening statement. And it says, when Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your sovereign foresight has brought about reforms in this nation, everywhere and in every day, most excellent Felix. We acknowledge this and with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you any further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. He sounds like a pretty good politician, doesn't he? You know, okay, we're standing before this governor, and if you recall, we've got the governor Pontius Pilate with Jesus, and I don't know if there was somebody else in between Pilate and Felix. Wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't, because there's a long period of time here. But here we've got this man Felix, and this man Felix is kind of interesting in and of himself, in that secular history tells us that he was actually, he and his brother both grew up as slaves in the Roman Empire. And then from there, they secured their freedom somehow, and they started about as freemen. And then somehow, the older brother, Felix's older brother, got in good with the emperor. And because of that, then they worked their way into politics. And Tacitus, and a Roman historian, he said that he had he acted like a tyrant. He had the disposition of a tyrant, but at the same time, he had the disposition of the slave as well. And so he would act very brutal and very ruthlessly when it served his purposes, but at the same time, he would just kind of default back into just what he would have grown up to be. And so that was kind of an interesting little take on this man Felix. Okay, so here is Tertullus, and after he makes this introduction, what we see is that starting in verse number 5 is that Tertullus now starts to go on to give his accusations. Now, to this point, prior to this point, we really don't have any charges against Paul, do we? I mean, what were the charges against Paul when the commander grabbed him and pulled him up on the stairs of the fortress? There wasn't anything. What's that? I mean, at that time, we know that the people were mad. It was started because somebody from Asia Minor saw him in the temple and assumed that he brought a Gentile in there, right? And so, that's what started it. But as far as the riot itself, people were shouting one thing and somebody was shouting the other thing. A lot of times when you got a mob and a riot going on, some people are there for just any old reason, right? And so there's not really charges then. When he gets to the Sanhedrin court, what are the charges then? There aren't any, are there? I mean, Listus just brought him there to try to get to the bottom of what's going on. And as they were about to, question him, Paul made the statement about how he is on hope for the trial, on hope for the resurrection. And then, all heck broke loose there. And so, was there any charges that came out of that? There's not, okay? And so here they've got charges. And you notice in verse number 5, he says, "We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect and has even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him." Okay? Now, here's a question. How did they find that out? If they didn't find it out from Listus, if they didn't find it out from the Sanhedrin, and how did they find that out? He's saying, we have found this out. Okay, well, how did they find that out? Right? Okay. So you can see that, in that 1 day period where they're trying to figure out, first of all, they're figuring out what happened to Paul, where did he go, what's going on? And then that probably that 1 day period where they find out that he's at Caesarea and that they need to go up to Felix, then they start to say, okay, how are we going to approach this? Can't you see that really what they're doing is they've got a man in search of a crime here, right? It works the other way around. That's the way it should work, and that is you've got a crime and you search for the man. Well, here they got the man and they're searching for the crime. And so they're saying, okay, well, what are we going to do to really label this and to pin this on Paul? Okay, so they kind of knew what happened. They knew this riot was started. They knew that the temple was shut, everything like that. And so they're just saying, hey, he's a troublemaker. He's somebody who's just stirring up riots all over the world with Jews. He's a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. And so notice how they're framing Christianity. This is just this heretical sect of Judaism, and he is a ringleader of it. He's stirring up trouble. He's a pest, and he just is a big pain to us. And so somebody like that who's trying to desecrate the temple, that's why we seized him. Okay? Now, did they really do that? No, they didn't. You remember the ones who seized Paul were really the people. The Sanhedrin, the government structure of the Jews, they had nothing to do with it, right? Okay. So, it says that in verse number 8, by examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we're bringing him against him. And the Jews that were there joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. And so you can see they've got it all lined up. One guy says, hey, this is what the charges are. And everybody else says, yep, it's true, it's true, it's true, it's true, right? Okay. Well, it really isn't. And so after they make their case, then you notice that now Paul starts to, in verse number 10, he starts to make his case. As a matter of fact, just in verse number 10, you notice the contrast between Paul's opening statement and Tertullus's. He says in verse number 10, when the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defense. Okay? So, he's treating him respectfully. He's, saying, you are the authority, everything like that. But he's not trying to butter him up and, anything like that. He's just saying, hey, as the judge of our nation, I'm now ready to make my defense. And he goes on in verses 11 through 13 to really talk, to deny about these accusations. And so in verse number 11, he says, you can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago, I went up to Jerusalem to worship. That's what he was there to do. He wasn't there to cause trouble, cause problems with anybody. He was just simply there to worship, right? Okay? Verse number 12, he says, my accusers did not find me arguing with anyone in the temple, nor stirring up a crowd in the synagogues or anywhere else in the city. And so, here they are painting him as this man that's going to go and, try to stir up trouble, and he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, and he starts riots and everything like that. Paul's just saying, I wasn't doing any of that. He wasn't trying to debate with anybody. He wasn't trying to have a Bible discussion with anybody. He wasn't trying to, do anything. He was literally there just minding his own business, wasn't he? That was it. He had purified himself. He was in the temple, and that's all that there was to it. Now, of all of those charges, he's, starts riots, he's, all these things. He now goes on to make a certain confession in verse number 14. And in verse number 14 through verse number 16, what his confession is just that he was a follower of the way. Now, if you remember, as we've been studying the book of Acts, what is the way? It's Christianity, okay? And that's pretty much what Christianity was called back in the New Testament, as the way. And boy, it's really raining out there, isn't it? Okay. Well, as bad as it is, it could be worse. I thought it was supposed to be sunny. I didn't see that coming either, But somebody else said, no, it's supposed to rain. When was that decided? 5 minutes ago? Okay. Well, anyway, Missouri weather for you. Okay, where was I? So verse number 14. It says this, however, I admit that I worship the God of our fathers as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. And so what they're calling a sect, which they're really saying It's like a heretical offshoot of Judaism. He's saying, no, this is the way that I'm worshiping God. This is the way that I'm worshiping the God of our fathers. This is the way. This is because Jesus said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And so, this is the way that we are worshiping. We are worshiping God through Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And he says, I believe everything that agrees with the law and that is written in the prophets. Okay? So, if he agrees with everything that is in the law and that's written in the prophets, then is he somebody who's trying to overthrow Judaism? He's teaching things that are going to be contrary to Judaism, but he's not trying to overthrow the law. He's not trying to overthrow the New Testament or the Old Testament. He's just simply saying, I believe everything there in terms of what it's going to point to in the future. And what that is, he says in verse number 15, and I have the same hope in God as these men, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. Now, when he says that he has the same hope as these men, he's probably not talking about the high priest, because the high priest was the Sadducee, at least that's the way that they generally were, and they didn't have a belief in the resurrection. But it kind of makes you think that maybe some of these elders that are there, when all that died down, they started to get together and say, wait a minute, this isn't about us. This isn't about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We can have these discussions later on. This is really about Paul, and this is really about what Paul is doing with, Christianity. And so let's become, friends, and let's jump back in on Paul. It had to be that way in order for him to say, I agree with these men as far as the resurrection. If all of those people that were there were Sadducees, he couldn't say that, could he? Because as soon as he said, I agree with the resurrection like these men, they're going to say, no, wait a minute, we don't believe in the resurrection. He's on his own with that. Okay? But if there were Pharisees there, then he could say that, because he could say, I agree with these men, and then they couldn't say anything. So you see what Paul's doing here is he's trying to say, hey, wait a minute, this is not at all about anything that was going on. Instead, that's what he says, that he was there of the resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked, so I strive always to keep a clear conscience before God. So, he's really saying this is what my life is about. And when you stop and think about what Paul's life was about, it really was about serving Jesus Christ and doing what God wanted him to do because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the resurrection of the dead, in hope of the future resurrection of the dead. Now, is this something that you could go back to the Old Testament and say, hey, this is not anything that the law and the prophets are opposed to? In other words, are we to look at the New Testament and say the New Testament is something that's totally different than the Old Testament? You really shouldn't. I think that some people when we look at it through the lens of Christianity, especially modern Christianity, we want to see it that way. We want to see, okay, well, this is the Old Testament, and this is the way that things were in the Old Testament, and this is the New Testament, and this is the way that things are in the New Testament. The Old Testament, they had all that stuff, and the New Testament, we have all this stuff, and they're total opposites. They're polar opposites from one another. And so, you got, some people might say, you've got the Old Testament God, and then you've got the New Testament God, Jesus. And we like the New Testament God, Jesus, because he's kind and loving and merciful. But we don't like the Old Testament God because he's vengeful and, judges and everything like that. But, Jesus is God. God is Jesus. And in the Old Testament, it says, I'm the Lord, I changeth not. And so the same God in the New Testament, same God as the Old Testament. Okay? So what's different with the law is, I guess you could say that, the law is going to point to Christ. Okay? And with Christ is going to come the resurrection. So when Paul's saying, I agree with everything in the law, and I agree with everything in the prophets, what he's not talking about is he's not talking about the Jews' belief of the law. The Jews' belief of the law was that by what you do, you can be justified by God, before God. And so by the works of the law, we are going to become justified and we're going to show ourselves righteous before God. That's one thing that he did not do. As a matter of fact, when you look at Paul in Romans and Galatians, he talked about how you are not justified by the keeping of the law. Instead, you are justified by Jesus Christ. You are justified by your faith in Jesus Christ. And so, in terms of looking at the law, that wasn't it. Instead, by what he's saying as far as he believed in the law, he believed in all the prophets, he believed that Jesus was the one that kept the law, and that the law and the prophets were those that testified about Jesus Christ. And so, is Paul telling the truth here when he says this? Absolutely 100%. But is there an agreement between him and these Pharisees and the Sadducees? I mean, there's a stark contrast in what their theology is and what his theology is. But as far as what he's saying, it's absolutely 100% true. Okay? Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that? No? Okay. Well, going back, what we see is that, starting in verse number 17, is now Paul is going to give his own version of the events. He kind of touched on that back when he was denying the accusations, but that was really just simply, this is a denial of what they just said. And now he's really going on to say, this is what happened. In verse number 17, he says, after an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor, to present offerings. Okay? And so if you remember, that was one of the reasons why Paul wanted to go to Jerusalem. He had been going and collecting money from all of the Gentile churches to then go and to present it to the Jerusalem church, to the poor Christians that were there. And so he says that he was there ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts. And was he? Yeah, he was. He went and he purified himself, and he was paying for the charges of these Jewish Christians who were under that Nazarite vow. Okay? He says, there was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. In other words, I was just there. He says, but there are some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me. Okay? And so, wait a minute. We've got an idea of there's somebody out here that these people are hiding, Here's Tertullus and all the bigwigs. They're saying we found this and we found it's all absolutely true. But Paul is saying, wait a minute, there's really some people here that are making these accusations. They're the ones that really need to be here. Felix, you are not hearing the whole story here. Okay? So he says in verse number 20, or those who are here should state what crime they have found me when I stood before the Sanhedrin, unless it is this one thing that I shouted when I stood in their presence. It is concerning the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. That had to really needle the Sadducees that are there, right? But, when you think about it, what charges came out of the Sanhedrin court that day? Nothing. There were no charges. I mean, the only thing that could have been said and decided from that was that Paul said that he was on trial for the hope of the resurrection, right? And the whole discussion became about that. And so if there was anything that could have come out of that court, was just simply that Paul was saying, I'm here for the hope of the resurrection, which is something that he really was there in terms of where he's going to go all the way up to Caesar. Okay? So what happens is now Felix goes and he starts to take some action on the case in the next several verses. What he does in verse number 22 and verse number 23 is just simply to postpone the judgment on this, because he realizes, hey, I don't have all the facts here. primarily he doesn't have Listus, right? Because, he's got the letter from Listus, but he needs to find out from Listus himself what was really going on. So in verse number 22, it says, Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. He says, When Listus the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. And he ordered the guard to give him some freedom. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and to permit his friends to take care of his needs. And so, like I said, he was there in the palace, but, it's not like he was a prisoner there. Now, what's interesting is this man Felix again, right? Okay. Felix, it says here, he is well acquainted with the way. So what does that mean?
He knew about Christianity.
He knew about Christianity. And so, when Tertullus is saying he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, did Felix, when Felix found out, he's part of the way, he was probably thinking, wait a minute, these Christians aren't like that. Right? When you look at the New Testament, what Christians really went and formed riots? They didn't, did they? They were very peaceful people. And likewise today, that's really the way that we need to be as Christians as well. As a matter of fact, you take a look at Peter in 1 Peter, you take a look at what Paul said. They talked about obedience to the government, being subject to the government. Peter talked about how we need to go about in doing good, so that when people accuse you of wrongdoing, they'll be ashamed of it. And I do think that that's something that we as Christians can learn today, is that, we don't need to try to go and overthrow things. We don't need to go and, make these statements. We don't need to go and try to upset the apple cart, because to tell you the truth, it really doesn't matter who's in office. We're still in a lost and a dying world in sin, right? And it doesn't matter where the United States is in reference to, the broad scope of history, because we know that the broad scope of history is going to point to the second coming of Jesus Christ, and all the steps that are before it are steps that are leading up to that event, right? And so, as United States citizens, yes, we should have a voice. Yes, we should have a vote. Yes, we have the right given to us by our government before they take it away to make our wishes known, and we should do that. But as Christians, what we need to understand is that our citizenship is not of this world. Our citizenship is of heaven. And so therefore our lives really need to be concerned and preoccupied with other things. We can be concerned with what's going on in government and the state of affairs, but what we really need to be concerned about is more spiritual things in life. Okay? All right. Now, I don't know how I got onto that, other than to say, here's Felix, and he was acquainted with the way, right? So he was acquainted with the way that Christians were back then. And so when they were saying, here is this ringleader of the Nazarene sect, he could say, no, it's not that way at all, okay? He knew better. It's common sense. And so I think that's one reason why he decided, hey, you know what? I'm just going to get rid of these people and then say, hey, you know what? When Listus gets here, then we can take care of this, okay? Now, in verse number 24, something interesting happens, and that is that everybody goes on their way. Paul is there in the palace, he's got some freedom. But notice it says, several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla. Who's Drusilla? Drusilla is what it says here, a Jewess. Drusilla is also a daughter of the family of Herod. Okay, and so daughter-in-law, one of the two. But anyway, she was there, married to Herod's family, and I guess they split up. As a matter of fact, I think Felix was the one that split them up, and he came into the scene and married her. By the way, a little interesting fact of history: she had a son with that other marriage, and his name was Agrippa. And he died in the volcano of Vesuvius in 79 AD. Okay, a little fact of history there. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, so here's Drusilla. So you can see that here's Felix. He's there, presiding, the governor of Jerusalem. He's got a wife, a Jew, so he understands a little bit about Judaism. He also understands Christianity, so he knows what's going on. So he sends for Paul and listens to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul discoursed on righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for you. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you." Okay? So as Paul's sitting there talking about, salvation, and how people need to be saved, and how Paul's talking about how, a lot of what we might talk about today, and that is, you're talking about righteousness, and you talk about self-control, which sound very good on the surface. A lot of people say, oh yeah, we need righteous people, we need people who are self-controlled, which we do, but, sometimes it's easier to say it than to do it, right? And for Felix, he might have been looking up for those traits and those attributes of, somebody who's righteous, that's great. Somebody who's self-controlled, that's great. But did he have it in his life? Okay, so you remember what I've been talking about as far as who Felix has been, right? Okay, born a slave, became freeman. Okay, how did he get that? I don't know. Okay, and then worked his way into government, and then worked his way up to government. What slimy things did he have to do in order to advance that ladder? And his brother, right? Okay, so here he's married to Drusilla, and he's the one that broke up, Drusilla and the husband. And so, you can see that when Paul starts to talk about righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come, then it's starting to make Felix very uncomfortable, because he's starting to realize, wait a minute, I'm falling under judgment to come. All right? Being here, we were having this conversation earlier about, positivity and messages. And I was saying, there is a lot of positivity in the Bible, but sometimes you got to have the negativity there to offset it. The gospel message about forgiveness of sins is something that is great, and it's something that is refreshing. But in order to understand the forgiveness of sin, you've got to understand sin. If you don't understand sin, how are you going to understand the forgiveness of sin? Right? If you don't understand what it means to be lost, how is somebody going to understand what it means to be saved? If people don't understand the fact that people are under judgment, then they don't know the beauty of understanding what it means to have a Savior that's there. And so Felix, he probably called for Paul, and he was very interested, but, then, when he started to get down to that point, he was a little bit alarmed. And at the same time, he had ulterior motives, okay? So the ulterior motives are this. He says, that's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe. So he sent for him frequently and talked with him. And so, here's this slimy, corrupt politician, right? Let's call for Paul, and let's have this nice discussion with him, and maybe he's going to give me some money, and that will be a good reason for me to release him, right? Okay, and so but Paul didn't do it, and I think that probably the more that Felix talked to Paul about righteousness and self-control and judgment to come, and about faith in Jesus Christ, I imagine that Felix became more and more comfortable with those topics. Not comfortable in terms of he was accepting of them, but comfortable in terms of the hardness of his heart just increased and increased and increased to where he just became numb to it. And when you think about life and you think about the gospel in our society today, I think that for the most part, we as a society are hardened to the gospel message, partly because people have, quote unquote, heard it so much. I mean, they may not have really heard it. They certainly don't understand it. But they probably have heard about church. They probably heard about right and wrong. They probably have heard about sin. They probably have heard about heaven and hell and Jesus Christ. And, you know, you can just hear that some people are saying, oh, yeah, I've heard about all that stuff, yada, 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 just all. You see, it's that yada, yada, yada. It's that hardness of heart that just makes people numb to what these things really are, you know, and the what it really is in terms of sin and judgment that is coming, but we can find forgiveness and hope in Jesus Christ and hope in the resurrection. You know, when you really start to think about those things, that's a big deal, isn't it? You know, and it's certainly worth a whole lot more than the price of a bribe. Okay. So what we see is that in verse number 27 is just kind of a summation of what kind of happened to Paul during this time period. It says, when 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. But because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. So for 2 years, here's Paul in the palace at Caesarea, you know, going and talking to Felix on an occasion. And Felix is thinking, you know what? Hopefully he's going to give me money, but at the same time, if he's not going to give me money, I can have some other use for him. I can have some other value. I can just simply keep him here in jail, you know, and the juice will just simply be off my back. No sweat off my nose whatsoever. Boy, you know, just devaluing another person just simply for what they can do for you. All right, that's all we've got for this chapter. Anybody got any questions or comments on this? Yeah.
When Felix tells, you know, we're going to leave him in here, or whoever it was at the beginning, and it's not really a prison, and he can have his friends tend to his needs, does that mean that Paul was hurt or sick or something?
No, it just means that, you know, they could come and they could bring him things. Okay, you know, they can bring him food, they can bring him clothing, they can bring him letters from other people. You know, they can just be there to support him, you know, things like that. Okay, and so...
You know where Kentucky Fried Chicken got started?
I don't know.
Is there a punchline to this joke?
Isn't that where Kentucky Fried Chicken got started?
Yeah, Paul is saying, hey, I don't have a cell phone to call Jimmy John's. Can you run down and get one?
Hey, that sounds good too.
It does. All right. Anybody else got anything?